My name is Esther. I'm 34 years old, and today my husband sat in court and promised to leave me with nothing, not realizing that I'm the one who actually owns every single share of his $10 million company. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Lake Forest mansion should have felt warm, but I felt a sudden, sharp chill. I was sitting at the marble kitchen island, my shoulder-length blonde hair tucked behind my ear, scrolling through Julian's laptop. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for a digital copy of our son's birth certificate for a school registration. Then I saw it, a folder hidden inside a folder, labeled simply Project Reset. My heart did a strange, heavy thud against my ribs. I clicked. Inside were spreadsheets, detailed, cold, and calculated. They listed every asset we owned, but there was a column next to each one labeled Status After Separation. Next to the house, Julian. Next to the investment accounts, Julian. Next to his $10 million company, Apex Logistics, Julian. And next to my name, 0. There was even a timeline. Step 1, terminate joint credit cards. Step 2, serve papers at dinner. Step 3, evict within 48 hours. The sound of the front door, heavy oak door swinging open made me jump. I slammed the laptop shut just as the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain drifted into the kitchen. Julian walked in, looking every bit the self-made titan the magazines called him. His suit was tailored perfectly, his dark hair swept back, his eyes already dismissive before he even looked at me. "Esther," he said, tossing his keys onto the marble. The clatter sounded like a gunshot. "Why aren't you dressed? We have the charity gala in 2 hours." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt like I was seeing a stranger. 10 years. I had spent 10 years editing his speeches, calming his investors, and sacrificing my own career to raise our child while he climbed the ladder. "I found the folder, Julian," I said. My voice was quieter than I intended, but it cut through the room. He stopped mid-stride. He didn't look guilty. He didn't even look surprised. He slowly turned toward me, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. He walked over, leaning his hands on the island, invading my space. "We can skip the pleasantries," he whispered, his breath smelling of mint and cold ambition. "I'm done, Esther. I've outgrown this suburban domestic bliss, and I've outgrown you. You were a great starter wife, but I'm moving on to someone who actually matches my status." "Status?" I choked out. "I built this with you. I was there when you were working out of the barrage." "Correction," he sneered, reaching into his briefcase and sliding a thick manila envelope across the counter. "I built this. You just watched. Read the papers, Esther. The prenup you signed at 22 is iron-clad. You're leaving with the clothes in your closet and a pittance of a settlement. If you fight me, I'll make sure you don't even get that." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "By this time next month, Vanessa will be sitting in that chair, and you'll be a footnote I've forgotten. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I felt the world tilting. The glass house I lived in was shattering, and the shards were cutting me deep. But as I looked into his arrogant, mocking eyes, a tiny, hard spark ignited in the center of my chest. He thought he knew everything. He thought he had tracked every cent. But Julian had one fatal flaw. He always underestimated the quiet girl from a small town. "Is that so?" I managed to say, my fingers gripping the edge of the envelope. "He is," he said, turning his back on me as if I were already gone. "Pack a bag. I want you out by Monday." I watched him walk away, his footsteps heavy and confident on the hardwood. I didn't cry. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. "Hi, Dad," I whispered when the line picked up. "Is Mr. Henderson still practicing law? I need someone who remembers exactly what happened 12 years ago, before the garage." The transition from a 12-bedroom mansion to a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat didn't just happen, it felt like being shoved out of a moving car. Monday morning was gray and suffocating. Julian didn't even stay to watch me leave. He had important meetings, which really meant he was probably having breakfast with Vanessa. I packed my life into 12 cardboard boxes. As I hauled the last one toward my beat-up sedan, the gate to the estate clicked shut behind me. The sound was so final, so mechanical, that it made my teeth ache. My new place smelled like stale detergent and old floor wax. The walls were a shade of beige that looked like nicotine stains, and the radiator hissed like a cornered cat. I sat on my mattress, the only piece of furniture I'd managed to keep, and looked at my reflection in a cheap plastic-framed mirror I'd propped against the wall. My blonde hair was a mess, tangled from the wind, and my eyes looked sunken. I looked like the broken woman Julian wanted me to be. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my credit card. I needed the basics: milk, bread, some cleaning supplies. The local grocery store was brightly lit and hummed with the sound of refrigeration. I moved through the aisles like a ghost, picking up the cheapest versions of everything. No more organic berries or imported cheeses. At the checkout, the cashier, a teenage boy with a bored expression, swiped my card. Declined. "Try it again," I said, my heart starting to race. "It's a black card. It shouldn't be declined." He swiped it again. A sharp, rhythmic beeping filled the air. "Sorry, lady, it says account terminated. You got another way to pay?" I looked behind me. A line was forming. A woman I recognized from the PTA, someone who had sat at my dinner table just 3 months ago, was staring at the pile of generic brand cereal and bleach on the belt. She looked away quickly, the pity in her eyes sharper than any knife. I'll be right back," I stammered, my face burning. I walked out of the store, leaving the groceries behind. I sat in my car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and called Julian. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Julian, you cut off the cards? I'm at the grocery store. I can't even buy bread." "I told you, Esther." His voice was smooth, devoid of any warmth. "I'm taking everything. You don't get to live off my hard work anymore. If you're hungry, I suggest you find a job, or ask your father for a handout. Oh wait, he's as broke as you are now, isn't he?" "You're a monster," I whispered. "No," he chuckled. "I'm a businessman, and business is closed for you. Don't call me again unless it's to sign the final decree." He hung up. The silence in the car was heavy, but the humiliation was starting to turn into something else, something colder. Julian thought he had cut off my air, but he forgot that I was the one who taught him how to breathe in the first place. That night, I didn't go back to the apartment. I drove to the public library. It stayed open until 9 p.m. I found a terminal in the back, tucked away near the archives. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Julian always told the story of how he started Apex Logistics with a $500 loan from a friend. It was a great story for Forbes, but I remembered a different story. I remembered a rainy afternoon 12 years ago in my grandfather's study before the dementia took his mind. I remembered a dusty deed to a piece of industrial land and a patent for a routing algorithm my grandfather had developed for the military. I began to type, searching through the county's digital land records and the state's business and corporation archives from over a decade ago. Julian was a shark, but sharks don't look behind them. He had spent years covering his tracks, but I was the one filing his paperwork in the early days. I knew exactly which stone he hadn't turned over. As the library's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, I found the first piece of the puzzle, a scanned image of an original deed. It wasn't in Julian's name. It wasn't even in mine. I leaned back, a slow, grim smile finally touching my lips. "You want to play everything, Julian?" I whispered to the empty carrels. "Let's play." The air in Mr. Henderson's office smelled of old parchment, peppermint tea, and the kind of stillness you only find in buildings that have survived a century. It was a far cry from the glass and steel skyscraper Julian occupied, where the air was filtered, sterile, and smelled of nothing but expensive ambition. Mr. Henderson sat behind a desk made of dark, heavy oak that looked like it could anchor a ship. He was nearly 80, with skin like crinkled vellum and eyes that remained as sharp as two blue sparks. He had known my grandfather. He had written the very documents I had spent the last 3 nights hunting for. "I haven't seen you since the funeral, Esther," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He adjusted his spectacles, looking at the folder I had placed on his desk. "You look tired." "I'm a lot more than tired, Bill," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I tucked a stray lock of blonde hair behind my ear and leaned forward. "I need you to look at these land records and the original patent filing for the Apex routing algorithm. Julian is trying to take everything. He says the pre-nup protects the company." Mr. Henderson didn't say a word. He pulled the documents toward him, his gnarled fingers moving with surprising precision. He used a magnifying glass to scan the fine print of the 2013 filings. The only sound in the room was the steady tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner and the rain drumming against the window pane. I held my breath. My pulse was a frantic rhythm in my throat. If I was wrong about this, Julian wouldn't just win, he would erase me. Finally, he looked up. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something, triumph maybe, in his gaze. "Julian was always a bright boy," Mr. Henderson said, leaning back. The old chair creaked in protest. "But he was also a shortcut taker. He assumed that because your grandfather was fading at the end, and because you were his only heir, that what's hers is mine was a legal reality. It isn't." He tapped a yellowed page. "This land in the South Loop, the warehouse where Apex first started, it was never sold to the corporation. It was leased by your grandfather's estate to Julian's startup for a period of 10 years. That lease expired 18 months ago." "And the patent?" I whispered. "The patent for the core algorithm was never assigned to the company. It was held in a private trust for your grandfather's heirs. When he passed, that trust transferred to you. Julian has been using the technology and the land for over a year without a valid legal agreement. He's essentially been squatting on your inheritance to build his empire." I felt a rush of heat flood my face. "So the prenup?" "The prenup protects Julian's assets from being divided in a divorce," Henderson said, a small, grim smirk finally appearing. "But Esther, these aren't Julian's assets. According to these papers, Apex Logistics is built on a foundation of sand. Or rather, it's built on a foundation that belongs entirely to you. He didn't just forget to transfer the property, he never had the legal right to do it without your signature, and you never signed, did you?" "No," I said, the memory of those early chaotic days coming back. "He just told me to trust him with the paperwork. I was grieving. I signed the tax returns, but never any transfers." "He got greedy and he got lazy," Henderson said, closing the folder with a definitive thud. "He thinks he's the king of the mountain, but he forgot who owns the mountain." I stood up, feeling a strange, cold clarity. The humiliation of the grocery store, the dingy apartment, the mockery in Julian's voice, it all felt like it belonged to a different woman. "What's the next step?" I asked. "We don't tell him," Henderson said, his eyes twinkling. "We let him think he's winning. We let him bring his lawyers and his ego into that courtroom. We wait for him to try and take everything from you on the record. That's when we pull the rug." I walked out of the office and into the rain, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel cold. I felt like a storm was brewing, and I was the one who was going to break. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in staying invisible. I lived in the shadow of the woman I used to be. Every morning, the radiator in my tiny apartment groaned like a dying beast, and every night, the rhythmic thump-thump of the industrial dryers downstairs vibrated through my floorboards. I kept my blonde hair pulled back in a tight, sensible ponytail. I wore oversized sweaters and no makeup. I wanted Julian's private investigators, and I knew he had them, to report back that I was exactly where he wanted me. Broken, destitute, and defeated. The hardest part was the silence. I'd pick up my phone out of habit to check the Apex logistics news, only to see photos of Julian and Vanessa at the opera or launching a new shipping terminal in Savannah. Vanessa was always draped in silk, her hand possessively on Julian's arm. In one photo, Julian was laughing, his head thrown back, looking like a man who had finally shed a heavy, useless skin. Then came the final settlement conference. It wasn't court yet, but it was the last stop before the judge. We met in a conference room on the 50th floor of Julian's law firm. The room was all chrome and white leather, overlooking the gray, churning waters of Lake Michigan. Julian was already there, checking his watch. Vanessa sat in the corner, ostensibly as his consultant, though she spent the whole time scrolling through her phone, her diamond earrings catching the light. "You're late, Esther," Julian said without looking up. "Time is money, something you should probably start learning." I sat down opposite him. Mr. Henderson sat beside me, looking like a dusty relic in this high-tech tomb. He placed a single, thin folder on the table. Julian's lawyer, a man named Marcus, who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of ice, slid a document toward us. "This is the final offer, Esther. Julian has been generous. He's increased the one-time payout to $75,000. In exchange, you waive all future claims to Apex and move out of the Chicago area within 90 days. Julian leaned forward, his eyes cold and predatory. "Take it, Esther. It's more than you're worth. If we go to court next week, I'm instructing Marcus to invoke the bad faith clause in the pre-nup. You'll walk away with nothing but the clothes you wore today. I'll make sure you're so tied up in legal fees, you'll be in debt for the rest of your life." I looked at the paper. My hand trembled, partly from anger, partly because I needed him to see it. "Julian," I whispered, my voice sounding thin, "we were married for 10 years. I helped you write the original business plan on our kitchen table. Doesn't that mean anything?" "Business plans are just words, Esther," he snapped, his patience evaporating. "I'm the one who executed. I'm the one who took the risks. You were just there. Now sign the paper and go back to your laundry room." Vanessa let out a small, sharp giggle from the corner. I looked at Mr. Henderson. He gave me a microscopic nod. "I can't sign this," I said, pushing the paper back. Julian slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "Fine, you want to play the martyr? We'll do it in front of a judge. But remember this moment, Esther. I offered you a life raft. Next week, I'm going to watch you drown." He stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out without a backward glance. Vanessa followed him, her high heels clicking a triumphant rhythm on the polished floor. As the door hissed shut, the broken mask I'd been wearing finally slipped. I took a deep breath, the scent of expensive floor wax suddenly making me want to gag. "He's very confident," Mr. Henderson remarked, calmly packing his fountain pen into his coat pocket. "He's arrogant," I corrected, standing up and smoothing my thrift store sweater. "I think he's playing chess, but he doesn't even realize I'm the one who owns the board." "Next Tuesday, then," Henderson said.
Next Tuesday, I agreed. I walked out of the skyscraper and looked up at the sun glinting off the glass. Julian thought he was taking everything. He had no idea that by the time I was done, he wouldn't even own the chair he was sitting in.
The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I stood in front of my small, cracked mirror and did something I hadn't done in weeks. I brushed my blonde hair until it shone, letting it fall perfectly to my shoulders. I traded the oversized sweaters for a tailored navy blue blazer I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet. I didn't want to look like a victim today. I wanted to look like a woman who was reclaiming her name. The Cook County Courthouse was a labyrinth of marble and echoes. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood, floor polish, and the nervous sweat of people whose lives were about to be decided by a stranger in a black robe. Mr. Henderson met me at the heavy double doors of Courtroom 402. He looked sturdier today, his old leather briefcase bulging with the documents that were about to change everything. "Ready, Esther?" he asked, his voice a steady anchor. "Ready," I whispered. Inside, the room was surprisingly small for how much weight it held. Julian was already at the petitioner's table. He looked impeccable in a charcoal suit, leaning back with an air of utter boredom. When he saw me walk in, he didn't even stand. He just looked me up and down, a mocking half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Vanessa was in the front row of the gallery, wearing a bright red dress that felt like a splash of blood against the somber wood of the benches. She winked at me. The bailiff called us to order, and Judge Miller took the bench. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see through every lie in the room. "We are here to finalize the property distribution in the matter of Vance versus Vance," the judge began, her voice crisp. "Mr. Sterling, you represent the petitioner. Proceed." Julian's lawyer, Marcus, stood up with the grace of a shark. "Thank you, Your Honor. The terms are straightforward. There is a valid prenuptial agreement signed by both parties prior to the marriage. It clearly states that all business interests acquired by Mr. Vance remain his sole property. My client has been more than fair, offering a settlement of $75,000 despite the agreement requiring nothing." Marcus turned to look at me, his eyes cold. "Mrs. Vance has been a homemaker for the duration of the marriage. While we acknowledge her support, the law is clear. She has no claim to Apex Logistics." Julian leaned over and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "I told you, Esther, I'll take everything from you. By lunch, you'll be lucky if I let you keep your car." The judge looked over her spectacles at our table. "Mr. Henderson, does the respondent have anything to offer before I rule on the validity of the prenuptial agreement?" Mr. Henderson stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet room. He didn't look at Julian, he looked straight at the judge. "Your Honor, we do not contest the prenuptial agreement," Henderson said. A ripple of hushed whispers went through the room. Julian's smirk widened. He thought I'd just given up. He reached over and patted Marcus on the shoulder as if the game were already over. "However," Henderson continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming resonant and commanding, "we do contest the definition of Mr. Vance's assets. My client isn't asking for a piece of Julian's company. She is here to reclaim what has always been hers." The smirk on Julian didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced with a look of sheer, confused irritation. "What is he talking about?" he hissed to Marcus. "I have here," Henderson pulled a stack of papers from his bag, "the original land deed and the patent filings. They were never transferred. Julian Vance has been operating a $10 million company on stolen time and stolen property." I looked at Julian.
For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. The predator realized he was standing in a trap.
The courtroom, which had been filled with Julian's suffocating confidence moments ago, was now so quiet I could hear the rhythmic click, click, click of the court reporters typing. Julian's face went through a terrifying transformation. First, the blood drained from his cheeks until he was the color of chalk. Then a dark, hot red crept up his neck, staining his collar. "This is a joke," Julian barked, his voice cracking. He didn't wait for his lawyer to speak. He stood up, his chair screeching against the floorboards. "Your Honor, this is a desperate fabrication. I built that company from a garage. I've run it for a decade." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," said Judge Miller, her voice like a sheet of ice. She held out her hand. "Bailiff, bring me those documents." I watched as the papers, the thin, yellowed sheets that held my grandfather's legacy, were handed up to the bench. Julian was whispering frantically to Marcus. Marcus was sweating, his eyes darting across his own digital laptop screen, likely searching for a digital trail he had missed. "You see, Your Honor," Mr. Henderson said, standing tall, his voice steady and calm. "When Mr. Vance incorporated Apex Logistics, he listed the Thorn algorithm and the South Loop warehouse as the primary capital contributions for his shares, but he never held title to either. He was essentially trading in currency he didn't own." The judge flipped a page. "And there's no record of a transfer of ownership from the Silas Thorn estate." "None," Henderson replied. "In fact, the original bylaws of the corporation state that if the capital contributions were found to be invalid or unassigned within 10 years, the voting rights would default to the provider of said assets. That would be my client, Esther Vance." Vanessa, who had been lounging in the front row like a queen in waiting, stood up. Her face was twisted in a mask of confusion and rage. "Julian? What is he talking about? You said she was nobody." "Shut up, Vanessa," Julian snapped, his composure finally shattering. He turned his gaze on me, and for a second I saw the man I had married, the man who thought he could dominate every room by sheer force of will. "You think you're clever, Esther? This is a clerical error. My lawyers will bury you in paperwork for the next 50 years before you see a cent of my company." "It's not your company, Julian," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken directly to him in the courtroom. My voice wasn't shaking. It was cool, resonant, and certain. "I think," Mr. Henderson whispered to me, "you should prepare to change the locks on the office doors, Esther." The silence that followed the judge's words was heavy, like the air before a massive landslide. I watched Julian. He was staring at the mahogany table, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. Beside him, Marcus was frantically typing on his laptop, his face slick with sweat. "I am issuing a temporary restraining order on all corporate accounts for Apex Logistics," Judge Miller announced, her gavel poised. "Furthermore, based on the evidence of title and the expiration of the lease, I am appointing an independent auditor to verify the ownership structure. But as of this moment, Mr. Vance, you are barred from making any executive decisions or moving any company funds." Thump. The gavel hit the sound block and the room exploded. "Julian!" Vanessa's voice rose above the din, sharp and panicked. She had moved from the gallery to the railing. "What does she mean, barred? What about the house? What about the vacation in St. Tropez?" Julian didn't answer her. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The smirk was gone. The predatory fire was gone. In its place was a raw, naked desperation that made him look 20 years older. "Esther," he rasped, his voice cracking, "let's be reasonable. We can settle this. I'll double the offer. 500,000. No, 1,000,000. Just tell the judge it was a misunderstanding." I stood up, smoothing my navy blazer. I felt a strange sense of peace. For 10 years, I had lived in his shadow, believing I was the lucky one to be by his side. I had let him make me feel small so he could feel giant. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Julian," I said, my voice steady enough to cut through his panic. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you let those leases expire. You thought I'd never look. You thought I was too weak to fight back." "You're destroying me," he hissed, leaning over the table. "Everything I worked for." "No," I corrected him, "I'm taking back everything I worked for. The company wouldn't exist without my grandfather's mind, and it wouldn't have survived without my sacrifice. You were just the face of it. I'm the owner." Vanessa reached over the railing, grabbing Julian's arm. "Julian, do something! Tell her she can't do this!" Julian shook her off, his eyes never leaving mine. "You'll regret this, Esther. Without me, that company is nothing. The board will revolt. The investors will pull out." "The board has already been notified," Mr. Henderson interjected, standing up and checking his watch pocket. "In fact, as the majority stakeholder by default of the lapsed capital contribution, Mrs. Vance has called an emergency meeting for 2 o'clock this afternoon at the Apex headquarters." Julian's jaw dropped. The realization finally hit him. He wasn't just losing a divorce, he was losing his identity. He was being evicted from the life he had stolen. As we walked out of the courtroom, the hallway was swarming with reporters. Julian tried to shield his face, but the flashes of the cameras caught every line of his defeat. Vanessa was already 3 paces ahead of him, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice frantic as she likely called a lawyer of her own, or perhaps her next target. I walked down the marble steps of the courthouse, the cool afternoon air hitting my face. My car, the old, beat-up sedan Julian had mocked, was parked at the curb. I climbed in, but I didn't drive to the laundromat. I drove toward the north side, toward the glass and steel tower that had Vance written across the top in bold blue letters. By the time I pulled into the executive parking lot, the security guards were already standing at the entrance. They knew me. I had brought Julian dinner here 100 times. I had hosted their Christmas parties. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Vance," the head of security said, tipping his cap. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, then back at me. "We received the order from Mr. Henderson's office. Mr. Vance's keycards have been deactivated." I stepped out of the car, my blonde hair catching the light as I looked up at the building. "Thank you, Mike. Could you send someone up to the executive suite? There's a box of personal items on the desk that needs to be couched to a 1-bedroom apartment over a laundromat. Make sure you don't forget the sandalwood cologne." I walked through the revolving doors, the click of my heels echoing in the lobby. For the first time in my life, I wasn't there to support a man. I was there to run my company. The executive suite was silent. The air, once heavy with Julian's arrogance and the sharp scent of his expensive cigars, now smelled only of the rain-washed city outside. I stood at the threshold of his office. No, my office. And took a slow, deep breath. The mahogany desk was cluttered with his ego, a gold-plated pen set, a Leader of the Year trophy, and a framed photo of him shaking hands with the governor. I didn't see a single photo of me or our son. I walked over and swept the trophy into a cardboard box with a satisfying thud. The door clicked open behind me. It was the board of directors, 7 men in dark suits who had spent the last 5 years laughing at Julian's jokes and ignoring me at every company gala. They looked like they were walking into a lion's den. "Esther," one of them, a man named Arthur who had known my grandfather, said cautiously, "the court order is quite comprehensive, but surely we can discuss a transition period. The markets won't react well to Julian being—" "Julian is gone, Arthur," I said, sitting in the high-backed leather chair. It was too big for me, but I didn't mind. I liked the space. I leaned forward, my blonde hair catching the light of the setting sun. "And the markets will react just fine when they realize the person who actually designed the routing algorithm is now the one running the ships." I opened the folder on the desk. I've spent 10 years being the silent partner. I know every line of our debt, every contract we've signed, and exactly how much Julian has been overspending on his personal consulting fees. If you want to keep your seats on this board, you'll stop worrying about Julian and start looking at the Q4 projections I've just emailed to your tablets." The room remained silent. I saw Arthur look at his screen, his eyebrows rising in surprise. I had spent my nights in that dusty library doing more than just looking for deeds. I had been fixing the logistics holes Julian was too proud to notice. "First order of business," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity I hadn't felt since I was 22. "Julian Vance is officially terminated, effective immediately. There will be no severance. His personal belongings are currently being moved to his new residence above the Blue Wave laundromat. I believe he'll find the acoustic properties of the industrial dryers very humbling." One of the younger board members let out a suppressed snort of laughter. The tension in the room broke. 2 hours later, after the meeting adjourned and the lawyers finished their initial briefings, I was finally alone. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. The city was a grid of golden lights, pulsing like a circuit board, my grandfather's circuit board. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but you're nothing without me. Enjoy the empty house, Esther. You're going to die lonely in that office." I didn't delete it. I didn't even feel the urge to reply. I simply blocked the number. I picked up my coat and walked out, nodding to the night janitor. When I reached the car park, Mike, the security guard, was waiting by my car. He handed me a small velvet box. "Mr. Vance forgot this in his private safe, ma'am." I opened it. It was a necklace he'd bought for Vanessa, a diamond heart, flashy and hollow. I looked at it for a moment, then handed it back to Mike. "Sell it," I said. "Take the money and put it into the employee childcare fund. We're going to need it. We are expanding." I drove away from the tower, heading not to the mansion, but to a small, quiet park by the lake. I sat on a bench and watched the waves hit the shore. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't wondering what Julian wanted for dinner, or if I'd said the right thing to his investors, or if I was enough. I was Esther Thorne. I was a mother, a CEO, and the woman who turned a nightmare into a legacy. Julian had said he would take everything from me, but he forgot the one thing I had that he never could: the truth. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and I stood up, smoothing my blazer. I had a lot of work to do tomorrow, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't wait for the sun to come up.